You're listening to Civic from the San Francisco Public Press. Naturalist John Muir has been celebrated as the father of the national parks. But some of his early writings about Indigenous and African American people are being re-examined.
I mean, the fact that he espoused national parks, thought of them as unoccupied lands, they weren't unoccupied. They were occupied by very vibrant people who were living wonderful lives.
They say John Muir found Eden. He didn't find Eden. It was always there. And he was just a sheep herder.
I'm Mel Baker. This is Civic.
My name is John Muir. Well, I used to live here on this beautiful green-blue planet on bountiful, beautiful California. And in these mountains, the Sierra Nevada, my range of light, eh? And I'm back. I never could leave these mountains for any length of time. And I see among the mountain lovers here that many must feel the same, eh? I'm back, and I wish that I could say that I was back and grateful as I always have been when I've returned, back and joyful, back uplifted and inspired, but, well, truth to say, I'm back, but I'm really ticked off.
That's actor Lee Stetson playing John Muir in his one-man play, John Muir Live. During the 19th century industrial era, the man called the father of the national parks worked tirelessly to teach us about the value of nature for its own sake and the need for national parks. His contributions can't be denied, but when it comes to our love and understanding of the national parks, it can be easy to forget the people for the trees. The people, in this case, are the Miwuk tribe, who continue to live in and around Yosemite, just as their ancestors had for thousands of years. Sandra Roan Chapman, chairperson of the Southern Sierra Miwuk Nation, makes clear that we can also forget the people for the person. In this case, John Muir himself.
I think there's so many people that go into Yosemite, and we were the first stewards of the land, to be there. And, like they say, John Muir found Eden. He didn't find Eden. It was always there. And he was just a sheep herder. But the Native Americans have always been there taking care of the land, and they would burn off when they left so that the land would be clear and it'd be taken care of. And they just have a lot of knowledge that's been passed down from generation, how to do these things, how to take care of the land and the animals and how it works.
Which stories are told and who tells them shape our views about places like the national parks, and we have certainly told John Muir's story. His name is on 28 schools, a college, a mountain, a glacier, a Sierra Trail, a forest, a beach, a medical center, and ironically, a highway.
Everything you read about in Yosemite is about John Muir. We get, not just me, but the other tribes too, when we look at all the stuff they put on there about John Muir, like over there at Bridalveil, and they wanted to put this sign up there, and it had John Muir on there, and one of the tribal members from the east side said, "Why do we always have to have John Muir on our signs? Why do we always have to have that?" So to me, it's like, if it wasn't him, it would have been somebody else, I mean, when they took the land away and came in and they sold our land to people for $1.25 an acre, and then if they couldn't sell it, then they ended up just giving it to somebody. With John Muir, I think because his is so publicized, it's hard to defend him because he didn't know the Indians. He didn't know who they were. He didn't know their struggles. He didn't know what they were going through. When they ran out of Yosemite and they took them down to Fresno and they migrated back, they did what they had to do so they could stay there.
When we place one person on a pedestal, it's no surprise when they fall.
Environmentalist John Muir is being scrutinized under a 2020 spotlight. He founded the Sierra Club 128 years ago. Today, they issued a statement saying they're going to re-examine our substantial role in perpetuating white supremacy. They cited Muir's friendships with people who believed in eugenics and said he made derogatory comments about black people and indigenous people that drew on deeply harmful racist stereotypes.
I'm here at the John Muir National Historic Site in Martinez. The house up on the hill is where he spent about the last 25 years of his life. This is where he lived when he founded the Sierra Club. And today, that organization is calling him out for racism.
Muir's legacy as founder of the Sierra Club was called into question by the Sierra Club itself in 2020, around the time of the national racial reckoning following George Floyd's murder by a Minneapolis police officer. The organization acknowledged some of Muir's early statements about African Americans in the post-Civil War South and Native tribes, whom he called dirty. In June of 2020, the Sierra Club wrote, quote, Muir was not immune to the racism peddled by many in the early conservation movement. He made derogatory comments about black people and indigenous people that drew on deeply hurtful racial stereotypes, though his views evolved later in his life, unquote. The flurry of quick-hit press coverage that followed left many with the belief that Muir should now be viewed primarily as a racist. But is that fair? In this episode, I want to wrestle a bit with complexity, which is often missed in this social media era. Can we tell Muir's story while also telling the stories of the living communities for whom the national parks are still home? Chairperson Sandra Roan Chapman reminds us they haven't gone anywhere.
The things that I always remember is that my elder saying, they ran us out of Yosemite, but he said, we're still here. And because we have our laughter and we have our ceremonies and we stay positive. With everything that we've gone through, all the hardships and everything that we've had, we still stay positive. And that's what you have to do. Because if you bring in that negative, and he was saying that's like the dark side, then that brings you down.
We can't forget the darkness in some of what Muir wrote. But we can try to imagine ourselves into his time, place, and culture.
My name is Lee Stetson, and I live in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada very happily. And I am an actor, have been, and a writer, have been for about 40 years here in Yosemite or in this area.
Lee has written 6 plays about Muir, visited many of the places he traveled to, and where he grew up. He's studied his writings extensively, and he's thought long and hard about the contradictions of John Muir. We spoke with Lee Stetson on the deck of his home in the Merced River Canyon just outside Yosemite National Park. Of course, you can't interview the embodiment of John Muir inside a stuffy studio, so you'll hear the sounds of some non-native turkeys mixed in with native bird song and the sounds of what Muir called Lord Man and his machines.
Context is the question. It's very hard to throw us back in history, and how do we measure the consciousness of people at a time when life was very different? Consider what Muir was all about. I mean, an immigrant coming to a new country, living among Scots people in the wilderness of Wisconsin, encountering few Indians indeed, but all of which had already encountered tremendous disruptions in their lives. And if you were to look at his boyhood and youth and his writing of it, he was quite sympathetic to the Indian population that he encountered. A bit fearful of them, perhaps, because that was the tenor of the day. But there's almost no meanness in anything that Muir ever wrote about the Indian cultures that he encountered in Wisconsin as a young boy, or in the ones that he encountered here in Yosemite. The other thing that we have to consider is that comments from a young man who was first encountering black people in the South as he walked down to the Florida Keys from Kentucky. His comments on the Indian cultures that he met were shattered cultures. Yeah, they were the opinions of a young man who had been just observing what he was coming across. To look at a lifespan of development and the growth of an individual, When he arrived in Alaska, he was accompanied by and guided by Indians. He became incredibly fond of the Indians that he met. He was engaged with the Indian cultures that were fully intact. His understanding of their loyalties, their family situations and so forth, their culture in general, how they governed themselves, is all in the record and certainly very positive in every way. Now, there is certainly an understanding on the part of the indigenous people of America are rightfully offended by any comment that Muir might have made in those early days, and they certainly would be entitled to understand that America was racist in a big way, and certainly by annihilating the cultures that they encountered, even during most of Muir's lifetime. I mean, right through the 1870s and 80s, we were slaughtering peoples who had long established themselves in a grand relationship with the planet. I mean, they were people who, were easily dismissed by the capitalistic and Christian efforts of the immigrants coming across that wanted to take their land, eliminate their cultures. So if I were a member of the black community, I would be offended by the comments that Muir might have made as he sauntered south. I would certainly be offended by anybody in the indigenous community. I mean, because they were displaced by some of Muir's ideas. I mean, the fact that he espoused national parks, thought of them as unoccupied lands. They weren't unoccupied. They were occupied by very vibrant people who were living wonderful lives until they were disrupted by the colonialists that came in to destroy them. So in that sense, Muir is part of, but an insignificant part in terms of what he later accomplished. I mean, let us look at what his contributions were before we look at the small failings of his young life.
We're going to take a short break, and then we'll get back to the story about the legacy of John Muir. You're listening to Civic from the San Francisco Public Press.
KSFP would like to thank the awesome, forward-thinking institutional funders of the San Francisco Public Press, including the San Francisco Foundation, the James Irvine Foundation, the Riva and David Logan Foundation, ProPublica, Craig Newmark Philanthropies, the Inasmuch Foundation, the Fund for Nonprofit News at the Miami Foundation, the Fund for Investigative Journalism, Renaissance Journalism, the California Endowment, the Google News Initiative, the Facebook Journalism Project, the Investigative Editing Corps, the Fund for Environmental Journalism, Catchlight, the Institute for Nonprofit News, and the local independent online news publishers. This is KSFP LP San Francisco, 102.5 FM.
Let's continue our look at John Muir with more from Lee Stetson's play, John Muir Live.
Not so long ago, in Martinez, California, my home here in California, well, they named for me a bank. A bank. And not far from there, a housing subdivision. And to prove that they had no idea of why I bothered to live, they have named for me, whizzing past my historic home there in Martinez, the great superhighway, they have named the John Muir Parkway. Really ticks me off.
So John Muir would have plenty to be ticked off about in the 21st century, including the continued degradation of the environment. Lee says the fact that the Hetch Hetchy Valley remains drowned behind O'Shaughnessy Dam would probably be his greatest disappointment. Civic traveled to Hetch Hetchy in the little-visited northwest corner of Yosemite National Park to see the dam and the reservoir.
You can drive there, stand on top of the valley, looking down on it, and observe what should be looking almost exactly like Yosemite Valley. A little smaller in overall dimensions, but nonetheless is absolutely the same valley as Yosemite Valley.
Standing at the edge of the water, you can clearly see that you are on top of what was once a high cliff, and even hear the sound of the Wapoma Falls across the reservoir, a waterfall that once rivaled Yosemite Falls, but now only the top third or so of that great waterfall is visible as it pours into the surface of the reservoir 306 feet above the Drowned Valley floor. You're also struck by the fact that much of San Francisco's claim to being green stems from the clean hydropower it gets from the dam and the pristine water that residents use for drinking, but also for flushing their toilets. It can leave you a little ticked off yourself. Lee Stetson's very first play about Muir, Conversation with a Tramp, covered the last part of his life when Muir lamented the destruction of the valley, which he believed was an equal to Yosemite. Stetson is a supporter of the Restore Hetch Hetchy movement, which calls for the removal of the dam and a chance for the valley to eventually return to wilderness.
When it was decided that the city of San Francisco could actually use part of our national park to pump water to San Francisco, it was clearly an economic decision that was certainly agreeable to a great many citizens in California at the time. Muir was heartily opposed to it because it was a valley that had never been terribly abused at that point. It was visited by so few people because it was more difficult to access. But like Yosemite Valley, which is also considered by some water planners to be a very likely spot for a good dam, and for the same reason. It is a U-shaped glacial valley. At the bottom of the U is where the great walls come together. And to block that is to have your dam capabilities fully developed almost for you. And so it was an easy call for the water developers and the city of San Francisco. The earthquake of 1906 obviously promoted the idea vigorously and probably put the nail in the coffin for Hetch Hetchy at the time. But to block up that valley and to drown it to a depth of 400 feet was to essentially obliterate a great national treasure. And it could very easily have stored that water downstream, and even more easily we could do that today. There would be some loss. There would be a loss of electrical power that is currently generated, but that can be replaced and should be. And there would be a loss of the purity of the water to some degree because most of that water is coming down glacial rock as opposed to bringing out a whole lot of soil. So it could easily blow a hole in it. Most of that sand would pour out of it as built up at the bottom of it. And in a few generations, we could have that valley back to us in a significant degree. As I've often said, we would have a bathtub ring around it for a number of centuries probably. But hey, the planet can handle a couple of centuries, and to get the plant people and the fellow creatures that we all share with in Yosemite, have them back there, that would happen pretty quickly.
Lee Stetson has a long beard like Muir himself, so no elaborate costume change is necessary to play Muir. Back on his patio, he transformed himself into Muir by putting on an old beaten hat.
All right.
As in his plays, Stetson uses his extensive knowledge of Muir's writing, his life, and background to answer questions as Muir himself might have answered them. Old hat now in place, I asked Mr. Muir what he thought about the national parks today.
It's getting difficult in some of the areas that I've been to recently in the wilderness of America, where it's becoming difficult to see the forests for the people. It is an extraordinary thing to observe a piece of wilderness when you accompanied by elbows on both sides of you. It's a different kind of experience than the one I used to experience and hoped for everybody. You know, solitude and silence are two of the great values of engaging in the wilderness and enjoying wild places, to observe quietly and hopefully more alone than not the workings of this good planet, to sit back and relax and enjoy all of that. But let me not diminish the fact that tremendous numbers of wild places have been created since I was wandering the planet. And they all have great attributes that people should go out and enjoy and engage as much as possible. But to walk off the road in the high country, a mile or so, is to find that kind of solitude and silence that I think really buoys up the human spirit.
In the most important political moment of his life, John Muir convinced President Teddy Roosevelt to spend 3 days camping with him in Yosemite in May of 1903. Muir convinced the nature-loving president to create more national parks and monuments, setting a precedent for the future. I asked Muir where he would take political and business leaders today to demonstrate the value of wilderness for its own sake.
The Hetch Hetchy Reservoir would be one of the places, of course, that I think one could find a great deal of instruction in, and then to take them to Yosemite Valley and to show them what the Hetch Hetchy could look like. Whenever you try to pick out anything by itself, you find it hitched to everything else in the universe. They need to look at what they're looking at for wildness and see in it that it is related to everything else, and that to preserve it is to preserve the loving process of creation. It is an enormously important thing to be doing, and human beings are not very good at it at this point. So any kind of observation of the wilderness that has been destroyed and could be restored would be what I would take any politician to and say, let's look at this problem.
Land restoration will likely be even more important in coming decades as future generations face the ravages of the climate crisis. That work would gain a great deal from fully integrating the knowledge and wisdom of native peoples like the Miwuk. In future episodes, we'll look at their fight for federal recognition, acquiring resources for their community, educating the young in their culture, and the National Park Service's agreement to give the tribe control of the site of a former native village in Yosemite Valley that was torn down and burned by the Park Service in the 1960s. While Muir is no longer here to explain what he thought and why, we can nonetheless take inspiration from his words, even as we take him off his pedestal as an unflawed environmental saint. And finally, I asked the spirit of John Muir, for the average person, what would you remind them about wilderness?
To go to it. Go because everybody needs to be kind, at least to themselves. And go because everybody needs beauty as well as bread, and places to pray in and play in where nature may heal and cheer and give strength to body and soul alike. Go quietly. Go alone, no harm will befall you, and go often. Go all your life. As age comes on, one source of enjoyment after another is closed. But nature's sources, Yosemite sources, national park sources, will never fail you. And go ultimately because in the going lies the answer to those who would destroy our wilderness through greed and arrogance and ignorance. For if enough of us go and play among the spirits of the wilderness, jumping from rock to rock, tracing the streams and the rivers to their sources, sauntering through the pine woods and the meadows, or spending a lazy afternoon at the river's edge, if enough of us do this, get in touch with the nerves of the Mother Earth, then we need not despair. For what we so learn to love, we shall not allow to be destroyed, And we can retain our faith, or our faith in the loving process of creation, to be sure, but our faith, too, in humanity, as a workman, our faith that the time is coming, and it must come, when every article of manufacture, every dwelling, every part of human activity will be as purely a work of loving creation as are the mountains and the pine trees and my bonny loving flowers. Go.
You've been listening to Civic, I'm Mel Baker. Civic is produced by KSFP LP, a project of the San Francisco Public Press. Special thanks to Sandra Roan Chapman, chairperson of the Southern Sierra Miwuk Nation, and Clay River, manager of the Miwamonte Healing Center, for helping us arrange our interview. More at southernmiwuknation.org. Special thanks also to Lee Stetson for his time and permission to use clips from his one-man show, John Muir Live. More at johnmuirlive.com. And thanks to my Yosemite co-conspirator and San Francisco Public Press reporter Jessica Prado, who recorded the interviews and is working on her own stories about the Southern Sierra Miwuk. Civic producer is Liana Wilcox. Contributor Sylvie Sturm. Publisher Lila LaHood. Executive Director of the San Francisco Public Press is Michael Stoll. Our theme music is by John Dillon. Thanks for listening.